I first watched Frasier quite a few years ago when I was in uni and really enjoyed it, but dropped off after the third season because our TV license ran out. Fast forward to now, where I wanted to show my wife the show, and I was afraid that it wouldn't be quite as good as I remember. I really couldn't have been more wrong, however. Maybe it was just due to me being older and being able to appreciate the jokes a bit more, or that I now had someone to watch it with. But Frasier turned out to be one of the greatest comedy shows, if not the greatest, that I have ever seen. That's very high praise, and upon more research, I found that that praise wasn't just shared by me, but by many others as well. Over its 11-season run, Frasier and its cast won 37 Emmys, with 5 of those being a consecutive win for Outstanding Comedy Series. There are many reasons that I could cite for the show's critical and commercial success. The writing is tight and witty.
But I'm afraid what the humidity will do to these loafers. Does calfskin pucker?
Yes, Niles. That's why on humid farms the calf is the most made fun of all the animals.
All of the actors are on point, all the time. It has a simple and easy to follow premise. But as always, I'm going to hone in on my most personal important factor for any story: character. Frasier is a show that has an absolutely stellar main cast, with every character being as good as the last. There is so much we can learn from the show in terms of how to build a great cast, not just for a comedy series, but for any story in general. This video then is going to be a deep dive into the show, without giving too many spoilers, and will hopefully cater not only to already standing Frasier fans, but also to people who have never watched a single episode. I'm John, this is the Author's Anvil, and let's get down to answering the question of why Frasier has such a brilliantly written cast. So let's just do a quick background into the show. For those who don't know, Frasier is a spin-off show set almost straight after the events of Cheers, and it follows the titular character of Frasier Crane, a high-flying psychiatrist who, after divorcing his second wife, decides to move back to his hometown of Seattle to pursue a career in radio psychiatry. He reconnects with his physically disabled father, Martin, and younger brother Niles, and navigates the world of dating, celebrity, and all the other hijinks you could imagine from a 90s sitcom. Aside from the 3 aforementioned characters, the main cast is also comprised of Martin's physical therapist and housekeeper Daphne, and Frasier's radio producer Roz. Oh, and of course, there is Eddie the dog. I'm going to give a quick individual breakdown of each of the main characters, and then we can move on to how and why they work so well together. Firstly then, we have our leading man, Dr. Frasier Crane. Frasier prides himself on his status as an upperclassman and intellectual, often coming across as snobby, prissy, and sometimes arrogant. His interests lie in a sophisticated culture. He speaks French, enjoys fine wine, goes to the opera, and collects antique art to decorate his apartment with. While all of this might make him unlikable and unrelatable to the average viewer, it's all balanced out by a set of equally good qualities. Frasier is incredibly kind and cares deeply for his friends and family, even though it takes time for him to properly bond with them. His background as a psychiatrist isn't just driven by intellectual desire, but also out of a genuine need to help people. He may look as though he is riding on a high horse, but that's only because he is a deeply ethical and principled person who stands up for himself and for people who are being wronged. While his upper-class tastes can sometimes come off as snobbish and foppish, there is also an equal charm and endearing quality to it all that more often than not makes you smile rather than roll your eyes. Dr. Niles Crane is Frasier's younger brother and shares similar tastes and characteristics of Frasier, even going so far as also pursuing a career in psychiatry. But they do have a few key differences. Niles is fussier, more introverted, and a bit of a germaphobe. While Frasier is often dominant in his relationships with women, Niles is often submissive. Niles has a sharper wit and is less obsessive, but is even more particular about the things he does and doesn't like. They share the same heart, however, and again, Niles is exceptionally kind to his loved ones. I always feel that Niles is a tad more perceptive than Frasier though, often able to immediately identify problems faster, and also being a bit more self-aware with his foppishness. The sire of the two brothers is Martin Crane, a widowed retired policeman who moves in with Frasier due to a debilitating injury to his hip. Martin is the straight man of the show. He's your average working class guy who likes sports, beer, and watching TV. He's practical, grounded, and has little interest in the cultural and intellectual worlds that his sons take part in. Martin is charming, but not in an exaggerated way, and he's always there to help pick up the pieces after Frasier and Niles have inevitably embarrassed themselves. However, He's also very stubborn, set in his ways, and sarcastic, especially when it comes to his son's shenanigans. Their interests and outlooks on life are so different that it causes them to come to blows, often to great comedic effect, however. Next up, we have Daphne Moon, a British physiotherapist who takes on the job as Frasier and Martin's housekeeper at the start of the show. She is eccentric, but not goofy, and believes in the paranormal, going so far as thinking that she has psychic powers. She is caring, patient, and despite her beliefs in the paranormal, she's again a pretty grounded character who doesn't have time for the nonsense that Frasier and Niles get up to in their high-flying world. Growing up with several older brothers in working-class Manchester has made her tough and appreciative of her more independent life in America. Our final main cast member is Roz, Frasier's radio producer and co-host. She's ambitious, fiercely independent, and has a very liberal attitude towards dating and sex. In contrast to someone like Daphne, Roz can be blunt, abrasive, and jokingly mean, especially towards Frasier and Niles. But she is also a fun, dependable, and down-to-earth friend who's as tough as nails and always ready to support her loved ones. Now that we have an overview of the show and its cast, let's now dive in deep as to why these characters work so well, and what lessons we can learn from them as writers. When I think of the best casts of characters, the ones that stick out to me as being memorable are ones where the characters all have some conflict with each other, at least at first. Conflict is at the heart of all stories. It creates tension, gives us a resolution or development to anticipate, and just generally adds a lot of spice to media. These conflicts do not need to be dramatic or world-ending, but they do need to be there, at least. Conflict between characters can be as simple as two people having an argument over a big issue, or having unresolved history between each other. As a quick example of another sitcom that I think does character conflict really well, I'd point to Scrubs. JD and Dr. Cox conflict over JD's desire to have a mentor figure. Dr. Kelso and Dr. Cox conflict over how the hospital should be run. Elliot and Turk conflict over JD's attention, etc., etc. If I were to give a negative example of where I think a lot of conflict is lacking, then I'd probably go after a show like Friends. Yes, I'm going after Friends. I know the show has plenty of episodes where the characters fall out and argue and get incestuous with one another, but at the start of the show, there really isn't much to do with their characters that causes underlying conflict between them. I guess Ross and Monica have a sibling rivalry, but other than that, there really isn't that much. Anyway, back to Frasier. As you might have guessed from the character descriptions, the cast of Frasier is rife with inherent conflict from the get-go. Frasier and Niles are both arrogant high-flyers who constantly compete with each other given that they're siblings and both pursue psychiatry as a career. Frasier is a Freudian while Niles is a Jungian. Frasier and Martin conflict as they are forced to live with each other and they both have very, very different likes and dislikes. Niles, who is married, instantly falls in love with Daphne in the first episode, and thus has a hidden conflict of at once trying to attract and resist her. Daphne, Roz, and Martin all conflict with Frasier and Niles' upper-class lifestyles, which is often used as a point of comedy or as part of the plot. Roz and Frasier conflict over how they run their radio show, and how Roz chooses to pursue sex and dating. I could go on and on, but I think I've given enough examples to demonstrate how deep the well is in terms of the stories that can be told with these characters. Everyone has a unique wit that they bring to the table, and even when the show isn't being funny, it is always being entertaining, thanks to the banter between its characters. Conflict between characters is essential for not just compelling comedy, but compelling stories, and Frasier has this in spades. Think about your favourite TV shows and films and books, and I guarantee that one of the things that you'll find upon closer examination is that the characters within them will have lots of this underlying conflict that we've talked about. So, we've established that our characters have all these underlying conflicts, but where do they go from there? I think inherently audiences find change interesting. There's only so much we can put up with seeing the same things over and over, so therefore a lot of great stories are filled with change. Character arcs are when aspects and personality traits of a character change over time. There can be positive changes, such as a character learning to embrace their responsibility as a hero, or negative change, such as a character becoming corrupted by wealth and power. Now, I'm not saying that every single character in a cast needs to go on some grandiose character arc to be satisfying in a story. Sometimes it's good for at least one or two characters to stay as they are in order to maintain a sense of familiarity with the audience, or maybe they're funny or interesting enough to the audience to not have to change. But I do believe that in stories with a large main cast, it's good to have at least one or two characters have an arc to follow, and Frasier is no exception. Without giving too many spoilers, Frasier is filled with subtle character arcs and relationship building that makes the show satisfying to watch on a binge, but still easy to follow if you dip into a random episode. The main one I'd like to highlight is the relationship between Frasier and Martin. At the start of the show, Frasier and Martin have a strained relationship, to say the least, and having to live together is tough for them both. But over the course of the show, they learn to adjust to each other's habits, to appreciate and respect one another, and this leads to some genuinely heartwarming moments between a father and son. Niles and Frasier, despite always having a sibling competitiveness with one another, also grow closer as they both struggle with fitting into their high society lives and pursuing relationships with women. Even Niles and Roz, who at the start of the show are the most distantly connected and loathe being in the same room together, grow to respect one another and even become friends. None of these arcs are particularly unique nor groundbreaking, but they are executed so elegantly over the course of the 11 years that they are absolutely worth studying. Frasier has very few moments where the characters become self-aware of these arcs and outright point them out, though writers of course employ the show don't tell technique so as not to patronise the audience. But I think what also makes these arcs satisfying, however, is the length of time that is given to each one. The writers don't try to shove in a different character arc for Frasier or Niles every season. Instead, they just focus on one or two major arcs that span out over the course of the 11 seasons. Don't get me wrong, you can absolutely have multiple satisfying character arcs occur in a single season of TV or even a single film, but more often than not, I find that exploring one issue thoroughly over a greater length of time not only makes it easier for the audience to follow along with the story, but is also much more realistic. Personal note, but I think people absolutely can and do change. However, it takes time and work, and these changes rarely happen overnight. Frasier really reflects this. There is very rarely an episode where any of the main cast are horribly out of character, and even when they are, there's usually a good explanation behind it. Despite some of the wacky and crazy situations the characters find themselves in, they still evolve naturally without ever losing their core traits, and again, this just makes the show so much more relatable and realistic than many other comedy series. The last main point that I want to make about how Frasier's cast is so perfect is the balance between variation and relatability between each character. Every character in a cast should bring something unique to a story, whether that's through personality traits or their relationship with another character. Again, character variation usually brings with it higher audience engagement, as it not only makes them feel fresh, but it also means that there's a higher chance that the audience will find a character who they relate to. However, this variation needs to be tempered with relatability. It's all well and good to have zany and larger-than-life characters to make your story interesting, but if they're all too crazy, then it's harder for your audience to relate to them. Relatability, especially in sitcoms that are almost always set in our real world, is essential as it helps your audience connect with your characters. And when your audience connects with a character, they become more engaged with the story, its stakes, and themes. So how does Frasier's main cast balance variation and relatability? Well, firstly, the size of the cast is a nice number. 5 people is enough to give us diversity, but isn't too many for the audience to have to keep track of. And then the other thing to talk about links back to our good old conflicts. Each character conflict that we talked about earlier is simple and something that almost everyone has or will experience. Frasier has to deal with caring for a parent who he doesn't get along well with. Niles has to deal with marital problems. Daphne is a fish out of water whose workplace is drastically different than her home's. Roz has to deal with a fussy boss. And Martin has to deal with understanding his 2 children who he is radically different to. None of these conflicts are world-ending, magical, or over the top, but instead are grounded in relatability. Just like in every aspect of storytelling, it's hard to come up with an exact, objective metric for determining how to balance character variation with character relatability in comedies, but what we can do at least is be aware that this balancing act exists, and write to hopefully work it in a way that suits the stories that we want to tell. And a good place to start studying this balance is Frasier. So we've done a pretty deep dive into the world and character cast of Frasier. We've determined that the writers of Frasier inserted a lot of underlying conflicts between the characters, gave a lot of the characters subtle and deeply explored character arcs, and then balanced each character with varied personalities and relatability. There is of course much more that I could say. I haven't even really touched on the incredible performances that bring these characters to life, and a whole other video essay could be dedicated to the host of supporting characters who are equally as well written and performed as the main cast. To name just my personal top 3 supporting characters for those Frasier fans out there, it would have to be Lilith, Frasier's imposing ex-wife.
Frasier, if you overanalyze every detail, you will rob us of the joy of the moment. It will be our wedding night all over again.
BB, Frasier's cutthroat agent.
When I'm happy, I work harder. When I work harder, you become famous and rich and powerful. That's what you want, isn't it? Fame and power.
And Kenny, the KACL radio manager from the latter half of the show onwards.
Here's men.
Oh yeah, here's women.
All right, stop it, both of you!
However, it goes without saying that the entire Frasier cast is full of fleshed out characters who you really feel as though you get to know over the 11-year run of the show. But even if you do just dip into 1 or 2 episodes, every character is so well realised and tightly written that you get a strong sense of who they are within minutes of them being on screen. For those thinking about watching Frasier, rest assured that there are many more elements of the show to enjoy other than its characters, and although I usually don't take too much stock in the Emmys or Oscars, it is very easy to see in this case why it won 37 of them back in the day. Frasier may not be a hot off the press release, but its sharp dialogue, 90s charm, and strongly written characters make the show, even to this day, both hilarious and heartwarming. Oh, you didn't think I was going to forget about the goodest boy to ever grace a television screen, did you? Eddie is Martin's pet dog, who moves in with Frasier at the start of the show. The 2 dog actors who played Eddie, Moose and his son Enzo, are both insanely well trained, and the content that they mined out of this character is crazy. Eddie is a source of aggravation towards Frasier, especially his constant staring, and is also a staunch companion for Martin and Daphne. The consistent humour and tricks performed by both Moose and Enzo never cease to provide an additional spicy element to the show, and again, there are some genuinely heartwarming moments shared between this little guy and the rest of the characters. Seriously, hats off to whoever trained Moose and Enzo, because the work that they did with these dogs was just absolutely incredible. If you don't want to watch Frasier for any other reason, then just watch it to see Eddie in action. Okay, bonus segment over, now to the outro. Thank you so much for watching. Hope this video was informative and persuaded you to watch or rewatch Frasier. It really is a fantastic show that retains a lot of its quality throughout all the 11 seasons. I'd like to give a quick shout out to the YouTube channel Frasier, whose compilations I used a lot for the footage in this video. Go check out their channel for bite-sized Frasier content. Anyway, hope you have a great day and keep writing.